Thank you so much to Chief Simon Foster. He might have snuck off that very important appointment that we had. I'm not sure. If he did, who would blame him? It's a beautiful evening in Toronto. And to Judy De Silva. You broke my heart with the words that you said tonight. When I met Judy in Sororan Park for a little pre-show picnic last night, and I got a waft of the incredible quiet power and integrity that she radiates, I thought, what the hell am I going to add to an event where Judy De Silva is speaking? So it's a mutual humility club that we have going on. The leadership of people like Judy and Chief Simon, it's powerful and it's inspiring. I'm lucky to share this stage with them. And there's no greater testament to the quality of that leadership than the fact that there's a new generation of leaders from Grassy Narrows. These extraordinary... These Grassy Narrows youth reflect the teaching that they've received. And so to their parents' generation and their grandparents' generation, we give our deepest thanks. And the youth themselves, not to leave them out, including that incredible song. I must have watched that song online like definitely between 20 and 30 times. And I cry every single time. And you did it again to me tonight, so I resent that. It's so true, their voices are so strong, the beats are so catchy. People buy their merch. Get out there and buy more merch. Thank you to Andrea for the traditional welcome and for your wise words. I want to acknowledge that we're here on sacred land, and as settlers, we're grateful for the opportunity to gather here and grateful to all the generations who took care of the land for us. And finally, I want to give a little shout out to David Sohn, who reached out to me to participate in this event. David's commitment and support and solidarity for this struggle make me want to do more and fight harder. So that is the greatest gift that you can give. I grew up in Scarborough. When I was a kid, my mom was a columnist for the Toronto Star, and my dad was a member of the provincial parliament for the Ontario NDP. I grew up in the 70s, so the sideburns were long and the shorts were short. And there were a lot of political and social issues that it felt like were emerging for the first time. Our house was filled with political talk. We listened as the grown-ups talked about pay equity and rent control and strikes at factories and disappearing farmland and industrial health and safety. It was not a typical upbringing in our middle-class bubble in Scarborough, where we lived in a big old house made from stones from Lake Ontario. But one of the things that the grown-ups talked about in the 70s when I was a kid affected me profoundly. There was a book of photographs that my sister and I found, and we were allowed to look at, even though it was a very grown-up book. It was called Minamata. It was by the legendary Life magazine photographer Eugene Smith. It was released in 1975 when I was 8 years old. Minamata was a city in Japan, as many of you know, that was devastated by decades of mercury contamination from industrial waste. Mercury that bioaccumulated in the seafood in the bay and was eaten by generations of the people there. And the impacts were so widespread that severe mercury poisoning became known as Minamata disease. Eugene Smith himself spent the last phase of his career documenting the people and the effects of that poisoning until the company responsible tried to scare him off. And he was brutally beaten by thugs sent by the company, and he limped away to end his career and his life just a few years later. We had that book of photographs of the people in Minamata because my dad was involved in the fight to get something done about the poisoning of the English Wabigoon River system by the Reed Pulp and Paper Company in the town of Dryden, which dumped mercury into the water for a decade before they were finally stopped in 1970. They were only stopped in 1970. But for the years that followed, the Ontario government bobbed and weaved and dissembled and denied, and despite the best efforts of this community and allies like my dad and others, the government never did a thing to really bring justice to those affected. Because of my dad's legislative activism, Grassy Narrows loomed large in my childhood imagination. I couldn't believe that kids my age, for the simple act of eating fish from lakes and rivers, could suffer such agonizing consequences. It exploded my privileged world to understand that such an injustice could occur and that nothing was done. I relate to that kid in the back seat that Andrea was talking about. I felt that way when I read that book about Minamata and I learned the story of Grassy Narrows in 1975. But it's not actually true that nothing was done. Something was done. Something is still being done. Today and every day for the past more than 50 years, this is a crime in progress. Every day that goes by without justice for Grassy Narrows is another attack on the land, on the water, on the animals, and the people that protect them, day after day, decade after decade. Just like the attacks of colonialism continue, from the genocide that founded this country, to its continuation in residential schools, to all the missing and murdered Indigenous women, those attacks continue every single day that justice is delayed and denied. So it's telling that more than half a century after the mercury poisoning began, it is still only researchers from Japan who are studying Minamata disease here in Ontario. The Ontario government has never admitted that diagnosis. They don't have the courage or decency to call it by its name. But Grassy Narrows has never given up. They've never stopped fighting. That's why the song Home to Me is so powerful, so beautiful, because it reminds us of the only force that can conquer all obstacles, the only force that can fuel the endless struggle required. It's love. Love of place, love of land, love of community, love of ceremony and traditional ways, love of fish and animals, of hunting and fishing, love of being in relation to all things. A worldview that sees humans embedded in nature rather than apart from it or master over it, that sees all things as interconnected, that values relationships of reciprocity, that thinks generations ahead and remembers generations before. So in preparation for tonight, I went back and I read some of the transcripts from the legislature in the 1970s. I know my dad, who spoke at the River Run a couple of years ago, did the same thing. And I picked a slightly different moment. There was one incident that jumped out at me. After the mercury poisoning came to light, commercial and recreational fishing was immediately banned in the whole area. And, you know, at the stroke of a pen, the entire economy of the region was gutted. Unemployment exploded from 5% to 95%, almost overnight, right? Even today, unemployment is 80% in the Grassy Narrows First Nation. And so the government of the day, in a revealing gesture of hopelessly colonial charity, constructed a building-sized freezer in Grassy Narrows and filled it with processed frozen fish. Now, like, just picture it. The people of Grassy Narrows, who had been, for untold generations, had been going out on the water, catching fresh fish, bringing them back, cleaning them, cooking them, eating them within hours, suddenly had a big, weird, square house in their community filled with boxes of frozen fillets. This was supposed to be some kind of solution. The cultural gap is breathtaking, you know? Of course, the people on the res didn't eat the weird, frozen, white people fish. They ignored it. It was entirely alien. It rotted away in its concrete bunker. Imagine if those fish could talk as they slowly decomposed, separated from their lakes, from their very skin and bones, from the people who fished them and thanked them and ate them. I don't think they would have voted for the government of the day. Anyway, for decades, even in the past few years, shockingly, clueless bureaucrats and politicians and journalists have pointed to this rotten fish, implying that the people of Grassy Narrows are lacking in some modern understanding that they're somehow to blame for their fate. It's stunning how completely they miss the obvious point and the obvious symbolism. What better image than a concrete bunker full of rot to tell us that paternalistic colonial solutions are way past their best before date. And yet the shelves still seem to be stocked full of them, do they not? This was brought home forcefully in just the past few days as the pattern of denial and deception from Queen's Park continued in much the same vein as it has for decades. It shouldn't be this way. We have a premier in this province who was Aboriginal Affairs Minister in 2012 at the time of the second river run. Who was here at the second river run? All right, I celebrate you guys who have been on this journey and welcome everybody else who's just arrived. So that year, 2012, the second river run, organizers set out a lovely table on the lawn of Queen's Park with place settings marked with the names of prominent politicians, including Kathleen Wynne. Waiters in starched aprons served fish that were brought specially from Grassy Narrows for the politicians to enjoy. Sadly, I can report that the pop-up Grassy Narrows fish restaurant didn't get any high-profile customers that day. But the minister did come out and talk to community members, and she promised to visit their territory, and visit she did. She went to Grassy Narrows. She said she was going to rebuild the relationship. She said famously that they were going to get it right this time. And the minister set up an Ontario Grassy Narrows working group to address mercury contamination. That group commissioned a review of the previous scientific literature, which goes back to the 1970s, and commissioned a new study to determine whether or not it's possible to clean up the river. That's the study you've been hearing about tonight. So far, so good, right? Except that while all this was happening, the Liberal government was ramming through a logging plan in the north of Ontario that would have increased clear-cutting in Grassy Narrows traditional territory. A plan that was drawn up without the participation, the knowledge, or the consent of the community. A plan for more of the clear-cut logging that the community had already been fighting for a decade, with Canada's longest-standing blockade, which started in 2002 and continues to this day. A blockade. A powerful, successful blockade that chased away some of the largest names in the global paper industry, Boise Cascade, various divisions of Abitibi, who submitted to the pressure that the community built up, gave up their logging licenses, pledged not to use wood from that area, from the land that had been poisoned originally by a pulp and paper mill. The same industry and the same poison. Because the Grassy Narrows First Nation learned in the course of their struggle that the clear-cutting that they were fighting was releasing the mercury that was lurking in the topsoil from the original contamination. The living legacy of environmental racism leaching out of the very earth. And while the government pushing this logging, despite the blockade, despite the campaign, was out of the other side of its mouth promising to change the relationship. This duplicity has become sadly familiar over the years. Successive governments, both federal and provincial, liberal and conservative, have been incredibly creative in finding reasons to do nothing about the mercury in Grassy Narrows. Some said, the water has healed itself, everything is safe now. I would eat the fish, except not if you serve it to me. Then I got a meeting. Some said it was a tragedy, but there was nothing that could be done. Some, like Kathleen Wynne, said that cleaning up the river was too dangerous because dredging up the sediment could release mercury and worsen the situation. But whatever the kaleidoscope of excuses, the result was always the same. Nothing was done. So if some were skeptical of Kathleen Wynne's newfound determination to get it right this time, they had good reason. Another episode. In February of this year, Grassy Narrows community members traveled to Geneva to address an expert committee of the United Nations Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. At that point, Deputy Chief Randy Fogister said, Prime Minister Trudeau says that Canada's back as a leader on the world stage. But how can Canada lead while mercury poison sits in our river and while our families drink unsafe water for 20 years? So back in February, a spokesperson for the Ontario Ministry of Environment and Climate Change responded to that claim about mercury poison, and I want you to remember these words. The spokesperson said, "There is no evidence to suggest that mercury levels in the river system are such that any remediation beyond continuing natural recovery is warranted or advisable." That was just February. But now, just this week, we have definitive scientific proof of a report from the working group that now Premier Wynne initiated. That report says in no uncertain terms that the river can be cleaned up, that remediation is possible, it's affordable, it's necessary. There isn't a shadow of doubt left to hide behind. The scientific evidence is in. A fact apparently missed by the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change, which told CBC yesterday that there is no evidence to suggest that mercury levels in the river system are such that any remediation beyond continuing natural recovery is warranted or advisable. Sound familiar? I mean, look, we all cut and paste, right? It's so easy in the digital age. But luckily, it's just as easy for activists to cut and paste into a search engine as it is for bureaucrats to cut and paste into a reply to CBC. So, let's pause for a moment and zoom out. What's wrong with these people? How can this long-standing crime against a brave and beautiful community and its land and its water and its animals be treated with such carelessness that it feels like contempt? I don't think the answer lies in the individuals. I think our whole secular system is sick. Our worldview is sick. It's out of balance. It values the wrong things. It sees people in need and builds bunkers full of rot. And I think it makes sense that a sick way of looking at the world creates a world in which people get sick for doing healthy things, like living off the land. And this contaminated worldview that produces contamination is not just about the Ontario government. It's not just about mercury poisoning. It's apparent to any government that wants to do, or be seen to do, the right thing when it comes to Indigenous rights, but hasn't done the much harder, deeper work of decolonizing itself, taking a long, hard look at its values, at its worldview. One more example. After a decade of outright racism and hostility from the Harper government, the Trudeau government has been getting a lot of love for its much improved discourse about First Nations rights. The latest installment, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. By the way, there's no good way to pronounce this acronym, so I'm just going to go with UNDRIP. Let's imagine that the declaration is a fix for a faucet that's been dripping for, let's say, 500 years. So where the Harper government had shamefully objected to it at the UN, the Trudeau government announced to much fanfare recently that Canada's objector status will end and we will implement the declaration. Headlines galore, the progressive establishment pats itself on the back, but just a few days before Carolyn Bennett was in New York, the NDP's Romeo Saganash had introduced a private member's bill that would, in a simple and straightforward fashion, commit the government to full implementation of UNDRIP. Of course, on that occasion, the Liberal government had coughed politely, shuffled the papers on its desk, and announced that it was working on a Canadian definition of UNDRIP. So we know the principle that they're scared of. It's the core of the Declaration, the right of Indigenous people to free, prior, informed consent to any resource development on their lands. The effective veto. Don't let any centrist Machiavellian strategist tell you it's not a veto. It's a veto. It should be a veto. Free, prior, informed consent. It's a beautiful phrase. You can almost hear the panic in the boardrooms at the very whisper of these words. But what on earth would a Canadian definition of that be? Or even more absurd, the latest suggestion that the Trudeau government is considering a so-called collaborative consent model. Like I say yes, you say no, and we agree at yes. That's the collaborative model. Consent is consent. It has to be free, it has to be prior, it has to be informed. Anything less is a denial of the inherent rights that First Nations have to their land. And let's thank our sisters in the Indigenous feminist movement who have made a brilliant analogy here. Whether it's bodies or territories, if you don't have the power to say no, then consent is meaningless. So while I'm committed to this brief zoom out section, ultimately, we know it's not about one politician or one government. It really is about our worldview. It's about the fact that, as my partner and muse, Naomi Klein, says, our economic system is at war with life on Earth. It's about the dominant mindset of our time, which sees everything as a commodity to be extracted. Starting, of course, with human beings, with workers, whose labor is mined at the lowest possible price all over the globe. But this extractive mindset, of course, includes natural resources, especially fossil fuels. It even includes, like, the real economy itself, the productive economy itself. A brief digression. The Panama Papers, for me, confirmed what we already knew, which is that the 1% see the entire global economy as a resource from which to extract value and stash it away in their parallel system where nobody else can get at it. So extractivism, a worldview that sees progress as a process of extracting value from things, this attitude has played a key historic role in the theft of Indigenous territory and the destruction of traditional life and livelihoods. It can be seen in brutal forms, extracting Indigenous children from their communities, shutting them away in residential schools, where their Indianness was to be extracted through force and abuse. But it can also be seen in more subtle ways. In fact, I would like to argue that the Trudeau government's desire to support UNDRIP without embracing its core principle is itself a form of extractivism. The latest commodity that the government wants to mine from Indigenous territory is consent itself. Right? Reconciliation, the way that our current government seems to want to do it, is an extractive process. Okay. Zoom back into Ontario, to the matter at hand. The expert study on the remediation of the English Wabigoon River system and the Wayne government. Yesterday, the Premier of Ontario stood in the legislature and made a formal apology to Indigenous people as part of the official response to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. She announced 26 initiatives, an investment of $250 million over just 3 years. She said the justice system will become, quote, responsive to Indigenous legal principles, autonomy, and cultures. She said that the curriculum in our schools would be changed to include teaching about, quote, the horrors of the residential school system, the betrayals of past governments. And I want to quote her at not length, but just a little bit more substantively. Quote, we do not approach reconciliation as something we need to get over with. We approach it as something we need to get right. There's no more denying the past or hiding from the truth. The duty owed to Indigenous partners is enshrined in our laws and in our values as Canadians. Building trustful, respectful relationships with Indigenous peoples and taking steps to end intergenerational cycles of trauma and inequality. This is our present task. One day it will be history. And then an hour later, the Premier returned to the House for a question period. And she was asked about the study. That excellent piece of scientific research that offers a concrete opportunity to enact some real-world, real-time reconciliation with one of the First Nations in this province that is most in need. But suddenly, the reconciler-in-chief seemed completely out of the loop. She said she hadn't seen the study, which is odd because her government paid for it. And again, she personally established the very working group that commissioned this report, which was delivered to her government weeks ago. The Premier went on to cast gentle doubt on the document, saying that she didn't know the source of it. As if the study was somehow a source of mystery, a conspiracy theory, or perhaps it had descended in a cone of light from a UFO. This morning, in question period, when the Premier was firmly pressed on these facts by France Gélinas of the NDP, the Premier admitted that, yes, her government had received the report in April and said that she had now read the recommendations. But she seized on a section of the report that called for more study, and she suggested that the report only offers partial solutions. Now, this is absurd. The report is crystal clear. I've read it. You can all read it. It lays out a path to heal the river and make it possible for people to once again fish without fear of being poisoned. So we can roll our eyes and say that nothing has changed. But in this case, I don't think that's quite right. I sensed today, and this may be totally wrong, my political radar is often quite off. I thought the ground started to move today. I thought the ground started to move. I think this is an astonishing moment where the juxtaposition of lame apologies and inaction on this report, which is so crystal clear, while at the same time these extravagant, beautiful words about reconciliation and all of these commitments, even the Queen's Park Press Gallery couldn't miss the significance of this juxtaposition. They are starting to get with the program. This government is going to feel heat for this. But it's not the press. It's not what happens in press. I think the extraordinary work of generations of Grassy Narrows activists is starting to pay off. The first generation, after the mercury poisoning came to light, fighting to shine a light on the crime that had been committed, pushing with allies in the legislature to lay the groundwork for justice. The blockade, the young mothers who started it, the whole preceding decade before the blockade of youth empowerment and organizing that led to that moment. The many community members who sustained the blockade in all weather, season after season, for so many years now. The river runs, 4 of them in 8 years, that have methodically unfolded a story. First river run, put Grassy Narrows back on the agenda. Second, establish that mercury contamination is still ongoing, still devastating. The third river run made the link between logging and mercury. And now with the fourth, we've got the action piece. We've got the action moment. The solution to all of these overlapping problems has been put squarely before the politicians and the people. We're in a moment here. Can you feel it? Yes. This is how change happens. With indefatigable struggle, bodies on the line, generations of commitment, all against an apparently impervious wall of institutional inertia. And then a crack, and then a fissure, and then if we push hard enough on the right spot, with the right force and the right alliances, fractures appear in the wall, and maybe, just maybe, it comes tumbling down. More than just the powerful and indomitable fighters of Grassy Narrows who have traveled so far to be with us here in Toronto once again. It's going to take the rest of us, allies to Indigenous struggle, coming together and understanding that this is our struggle, the struggle for the world we want. Now, new alliances have been the hallmark of many impressive victories in recent years. Think about the defeat of the Keystone XL pipeline, where TransCanada was so sure that it was going to win the pipeline that they bought the pipe. Like hundreds and hundreds of kilometers of pipe, which has been rotting in fields for years now. The Northern Gateway and Energy East pipelines, they're not moving because they're being stalled by new alliances of settler and Indigenous activism. The fracking ban in Quebec, the emergence of kayaktivists in the Port of Vancouver. You know about the kayaktivists? Look them up. It's starting to feel like victory in Grassy Narrows is within reach. And like all these recent alliances, it's not just a moral obligation, this is a strategic opportunity. Ever since I Don't Know More taught us that Indigenous land rights are the last best hope to defend the land that all of us depend on, more and more people are realizing how much we have to learn from our Indigenous teachers who have been resisting for hundreds of years. So as part of building... building a movement of movements that could really bring justice, climate justice, justice, refugee justice, indigenous justice, racial justice, gender justice. We have to come together around winnable struggles like this one, and we have to win. It's going to take trade unions. It's going to take faith groups. It's going to take green groups, anti-poverty activists. All of you who got organized to get here tonight have to bring 10 of your friends to the Queen's Park on Thursday at 12:30, and we have to make this happen. Now, if we can manifest that other worldview, that original one, that tells us that all things are interconnected, that we depend on each other, that what's happening to you is happening to me. We can win justice for Grassy Narrows, and we can start the long, hard work of true reconciliation here in this place right now. Grassy Narrows, you can show us how, and for that, we are really, really grateful. Thank you.